Africa has had a busy calendar in terms of these elections took place in the first quarter of the year. Though experts foresee the elections are unlikely to be competitive because of affiliations to the party in power, these processes raise questions for the continent of what qualifies as a genuine election and the legitimacy of emerges from an authentic popular mandate. Many of these countries have overcome long legacies of direct or indirect military government. A common and recurrent theme across these nations on the African continent is a strong desire for citizens to have their voices heard as part of the continent's aspirations for more responsive, public service-oriented and democratic governance, but without any civic engagements. They will only remain a dream. Ladies and gentlemen, if you're just joining us, this is Talking Point over your Pan-African channel for you, Media Africa. Thank you for joining us. Stay with us. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for honoring the invitation once again over your Pan-African channel for you, Media Africa. Today we're asking what are the stakes involved in elections taking place across the African continent, given that at the debut or the start of this year 2024, we saw several countries, almost 19 African countries, that were due to take part or go for elections. And of course, in line with that, the first quarter has passed and several nations across the African continent have had their elections, one of which we saw South Africa, we saw Senegal, we saw Chad, and a host of others recently. So we're asking what are the stakes involved as far as elections on the African continent is involved. To evoke this, joining us all the way from the U.S. this afternoon is Dr. Stanley FONGOD, who is a Pan-Africanist. Greetings to you, so you're welcome on board.
Thank you so much, Sharon, for having me, and I do appreciate the invitation, and also thank those who are watching us live as we have these discussions, and also those who will subsequently be watching the rebroadcast or the streamed links online. Thank you.
Thank you for always honoring our invitation. We shall equally be joined by Ms. Engineer ELVIS, who is the Secretary General of the Popular Actions Party. He doubles as a political analyst and a journalist. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for being through with us on this edition of Talking Points. Without further ado, we'll dive right into discussions this day with regards to elections on the African continent. So, Dr. Stanley, are elections a portal to Africa's development?
Absolutely. I think that we have come of age to fully understand the need for us to have elections that are free and fair on the continent of Africa, because that is the very tenet of any kind of a democratic society. If you're going to talk about democracy, its very emblem of democracy will be the issues of free and fair elections. Free and fair elections are extremely important in any democratic society. Once that falls apart, once there are absolutely no free elections, no fair elections, then the very tenets of democracy in itself, do not hold sway. So we have to be able to make sure that we have free and fair elections on the continent of Africa. You also have to fully understand that it is in having an opportunity for our citizens to be able to air out their opinions without fear of, being persecuted based upon the way they think, based upon whatever their political persuasions might be, but that there has to be discussions, dialogue, debates, on the public arena, in the public sphere, that allow people to be able to share their opinions as to what is it that they want, how they want things to be, without fearing for political persecution, which is too often, the rule of play on the African continent and even in some developed nations as well. We have to be able to make sure that we allow people to be able to participate, in the political process, allow them to participate, as people who go to the polls and cast their ballots without somebody holding a gun, to their head, or without somebody deterring them from doing so because of the consequences of them, falling on a different political aisle depending on which zone of the country that they belong to. These has to be issues that we fight and fight and fight to make sure that we allow people to participate in elections and have free and fair elections on the continent.
Exactly. It's all about having credible, transparent, as well as free and fair elections. Now, with the several elections that we have had since the start of this year, 2024, what are the stakes that the outcome of these elections is going to impact the political stability of the nation?
The reality is that it's the notion that we can somehow predict the future without understanding the past, it's an illusion. One of my mentors once said that if you want me to predict the future, I will tell you exactly how to predict the future. If you are asking me to predict your future, well, that necessarily changes that you have decided to be able to do. The next 5 years of your life would look exactly like the last 5 years, because obviously there's nothing that you have done that is different. So the idea that we can somewhat predict what Africa will look like based upon the elections that we have, or the elections that we are carrying out, I don't think that basically changes anything. As long as we are still involved in the same elections meandering, as long as we are still involved, in elections rigging, as long as we rig polls, as long as we basically deter people from participating in the electoral process, as long as we have people who are going to do whatever it takes to stay in power, because obviously their entire life and generation believes that if they leave power, something terrible, something horrible might happen to them. As long as that is the order of the day and the norms that we have on the continent, if I was going to be any kind of a political prophet, I would be saying to you that what we have experienced in the last 20 years will not be different from anything we're going to experience in the next 20 years, except some of the boys in the Sahel region begins to inspire a whole lot more Africans to take action. If not, things will remain the same. But I am quite optimistic that if we basically do whatever it takes to be able to come out en masse, okay? I'm talking about everybody coming out, those in the inner cities, those in the villages, those in the rural areas, coming out to vote and to support, and not just that, to basically also march to capital cities and demand that they be fair and free elections and allow whoever is the better, stronger candidate to win. Then without that, I am not optimistic about the continent.
Speaking of taking action, I recall what happened in, say, 2010 in Ivory Coast, where we saw Laurent Gbagbo at the time when he refused to concede defeat, and that led to instability for a while in the country. Now, looking at this scenario of how it would affect, say, political process like elections, how it's going to affect the stability of a nation. Before looking at that scenario that took place in Ivory Coast, do you think that elections on the African continent do have the capacity of actually impacting what we would term stability of every country?
Well, you see, you have to go country by country and ask, a very simple question. If you went to any country right now and asked anyone in that particular country and says to them, please, do you think that it would be good for us to basically create some kind of an instability in this particular nation because we are trying to be able to make sure that we have free and fair elections? Maybe a certain population, I'm not going to basically quantify how large they are because I don't know, but a quarter, a certain part of the population will say that yes, another part of the population will say no. And if you now dive in deeper statistically to find out those who will say no, these are folks who are basically making a killing or who are doing very well. When I say killing, I mean they're making good money, they're living well, they're doing good things. So they don't want this whole entire establishment that they have for themselves to be destabilized. The people who will say, you know what, let's do something about it, are those who are disenfranchised, are those who have been excluded from the political process. They've been excluded from the economic arena. They are not making money. They are living in poverty, and they are looking at the status quo. Their fathers lived in poverty. Their moms basically did whatever it was that they could do to send them to school. They have graduated out of our educational systems. They have no jobs, and they are hanging around believing and dreaming for a utopia that will not come. And so if you're going to ask them, should they be some kind of political, military interference rather in the political process, they would say to you, yes, please, let's destabilize this whole entire arena because we are trying to be able to do something for ourselves. So the problem is the population that says let's destabilize is absolutely growing because of the rate of poverty. The amount of people that are saying, please, let's not destabilize this community, let's not destabilize this society because it's not good, for long-term progress. We're going to become a Rwanda, and there's no benefit to mass-kill people just so that we can be able to enjoy a beautiful country tomorrow. That level of blood is not humane. We should not do that. But when the amount of people who are basically going through hell, they are sick to the stomach because of the establishment. The moment they begin to feel that there is no headwind, there is no way they can be able, to get out of this political quagmire that they have been placed in, guess what they do? They will do whatever it takes to be able to make sure that they destabilize the country. They will do whatever it takes to make sure that nothing works because they are telling themselves there is nothing for them to lose anyway. So the worst person to be able to bring into any kind of a political discussion is the person who has nothing to lose. And the idea right now is that we have to understand that there's a growing population of Africans who are willing to destabilize the continent, forget your country, who are willing to destabilize the whole entire continent to make sure that the political process we have on the continent of Africa is equitable to every African, not just the political elite.
Thank you, immensely, Dr. FONGOD. Now, proceeding forward, you earlier on mentioned that it might be a part of the African continent that might be willing to destabilize the continent, but then that is not our point of focus. Now, looking at civic engagement on the African continent, a lot of African voters at the time aspire for change to actually come through in their respective nations. But then we have this lack of the youth taking part in politics, actively taking part in politics. Now, with this aspect that has been looming for several years on the African continent, how is that going to derail, or better still, delay the process of how the outcome of elections is going to turn out across Africa?
Elections do have consequences, and that's one of the, the things that most Africans need to understand, and young people, for that matter, need to understand that elections absolutely do have consequences. The problem with the with anyone who is in the who is in politics is that we fully understand that once you have policies that are enacted in any administration, what happens with those policies, the long-term consequences or the changes that will come as a result of that policies might last 2 to 3 decades. So it is very important that young people understand this, that you cannot be talking about the future that you do not understand how the future is being structured. Your future is structured today based upon the kind of policies that the nation is involved in. If the policies that are being, that the nation is, that the present administrations in different nations are being carried out, in respect to our individual countries, those policies has maybe a decade or 2 decades, maturation time, most of them. And what that means is you will be in a particular country, and the country is moving in the trajectory that you do not like. You see all kinds of issues with inflation, monetary policies, fiscal policies that you don't like, environmental policies that are absolutely crazy. You will discover that there's a long-term effect, in terms of almost every sector of the country. Reasons being there is one man who came to power who did not understood exactly what to do, how to do it, never surrounded himself with people who were academically inclined in understanding different sectors of the economy, economy, okay, or never bringing experts in those sectors to basically come and advise on what needs to be done. Once young people basically do not understand this, they will basically think that when we start talking about those who have to be involved in politics, it should be someone in their 60s and somebody who is in their 70s or in their 80s for that matter. No. If you really want to be able to build a future that you want, you must be involved in the political process in your 20s. There is a reason for that, because in your 20s, you need to be able to structure the kind of future that you want in your 20s. Be involved in the political process. It's extremely important for young people to understand this, that you cannot live your entire life to men who basically do not even understand what is it that is propelling and pushing the generation in which you are in terms of technology and agriculture. If they do not even understand that, so how be it that you are living your entire future, you are allowing somebody who is in their 80s to make a decision that will affect the next 4 decades of your life. All right, long after they have gone, long after they've left the political scene. And that's why men in their 40s, in their 60s, in their 70s, and in their 80s could care less about whatever their legacies will be, because what they're trying to do is to eat as much as they can before they leave power. We have to be able to get young people to be involved in the political process, knowing mindfully well that whatever they do as young men, basically they are structuring their futures and the futures of other people coming after them. And so they know that they will have to do, especially if the elections are free and fair, people will have to live with the consequences of what is it that they have enacted in their own administration. That's the value of having free and fair elections. That's the value of allowing young people to be involved in the political process.
Exactly. Just to reiterate that this young population do constitute a majority of the population in every country, and of course them taking part in the electoral process actually is very important and imperative for the growth as well as the development of the country. Now, looking at the types of elections that do exist on the African continent, we've seen countries, let's look at countries like Senegal. We saw countries like Chad that do have 2-round systems, as well as the electoral types of elections which they have is concerned. But looking at a nation like South Africa, the country do has a unity government. I like to term that way because it is one that is... It is not 2 rounds like the case of other countries across the African continent. Now, what will be the impact, or what impact does this type of elections that do exist on the African continent have on the development trajectory of Africa?
Well, I'm not too sure if there are any issues, especially when it comes to the different types of election processes that we have on the continent of Africa, maybe in the case of South Africa and most other African countries. The issue for me has to do with rigging and irregularities. If you have an election that is known for people just rigging, believe me, if folks have to rig elections, even if it's a single round or a double round elections, people will still rig. So the future of the continent in relationship to how well we rig our election process basically just means that we bring in the most incompetent people to basically run us or lead us. So when you have folks who are absolutely not competent leading us, then that basically means that the whole entire country is absolutely not going to experience the prosperity that she deserves. We need to be able to allow people who have shown promise, people who have the skill sets to be able to carry out what is it that they say they want to do. Men with a clear-cut vision for the nation, clear-cut vision for the continent, to be able to lead us. And this is a challenge also to every young African person or everyone on the continent of Africa, that before you vote for somebody in your individual country, you must make sure that the person has a general perspective of the continent, not just your country. If the person's vision for your country is great, that's wonderful. But if the vision for the continent is not that good, then that individual basically is someone who can be manipulated with the West. We need Pan-Africans in our individual nations. So Do we need single round elections or double round elections? For me, it really do not matter. We might have to come to, I think maybe a single round will basically, I don't know, be too expensive and for us, but maybe a single round a single round might be the way to go. But then we also must be able to fight out the issues of voters intimidation. We must be able to fight out the issues of multiple voting strategies that people basically ignore. We must also be able to make sure that we fight out vote rigging, which is very common with a lot of ballots. There are people who have private ballots that's theirs. You know, you cannot have people running with private ballots in their vehicles. You know, voter cards for about 100 people with one person. That's totally irresponsible. We have to be able to fight this corruption no matter where we find them, and allow young people to be involved in the political process. No matter the political structure, no matter the voting structures that we have, all we need to do is to make sure that it's free and fair.
Exactly. The goal is having free and fair as well as balanced elections. Now, you mentioned something. Now, what about, or how can, say, technology play a key role in ensuring that we have free and fair elections across the continent? Because you mentioned that the electoral processes per se does not determine the progress or, say, determine the outcome of what a country would become. I would like to recall a lot of persons and experts, foreign media to be precise, had criticized the Rwandan President Paul Kagame for his vision or his way of leadership in Rwanda. But that was not the case, because he came out recently and he said that say leadership or democracy was not being defined by the West. With relation to that, how does technology play a key role in, say, curbing these issues of vote rigging, and how can a president or a leader actually come out to experience his vision for his nation without going through the processes of these electoral processes which we are seeing, or without getting the limitations of electoral processes per se across the African continent?
I think we have come of age in technology, and there's a lot of things that we can use to be able to make sure that we have free and fair elections on the continent of Africa. The first thing is we need to have some kind of a voter registration system that allows those to vote that are qualified to vote, and not just everyone voting who is not a citizen of that particular individual nation, and also allowing people to vote based upon the regions that they are in at the moment of the elections. Number one. Number two, we need to go to make sure that we basically move away gradually, to have a what we call a voter's ID for those who will show it at the polls, plus their identification card, which basically shows that, yes, this person who is voting, it's actually the same person with the same ID card. Reasons being that you don't want somebody to be able to show up at the poll with an ID card and then turn around with the same ID card, be voting at another location. So by the time you show up to a particular voter's registration, you are coming with a voter's ID, with a voter's card, and that voter's card basically carries your name, your picture, and everything. It's put into a system that basically states that you have voted. Once you have voted, you have voted. You cannot go to another station and vote at that particular station again. That's where technology comes in. In the era of blockchain technology, that electronic system will actually be connected to a blockchain, which means whatever it is that is done with the ledger, whatever it is that is done in relationship to the fact that you have voted, or any other persons for that matter, cannot be undone. If it's undone, the system will tell us is that you can change the system, you can change it, but you can't change the system. You can allow somebody to vote multiple times, but the system will tell us this particular individual voted multiple times because somebody was trying to rig the elections. That's the beauty of us having technology, so far as our voting is concerned. Any country that will refuse to have electronic monitoring systems, any country that will refuse to have electronic monitoring systems in their offices, in different ministries. I've seen this in some African countries, it's nothing else, because it's the only reason why they will refuse that is because they use papers to fraud. They use papers, to be able to eat money and basically sign some fake documentations to prove that they did something. Meanwhile, they never did. They never do. So the idea for us is that we need to be able to have people that understands understands technology, employ these tech systems in place so that we can have free and fair elections. And that will also mean that those who are in rural areas, those who are in hard to reach, areas on the continent or in our individual countries can also be able to participate in the electoral process where every vote counts, every voice counts. And believe me, if this was going to be the case in Africa, we will always have the best person, the best candidate to win our elections, not the dinosaurs we have in place.
Now, you said something about electoral bodies trying to reach out to remote areas. Looking at the case of the African continent, let's take a case study like the Democratic Republic of Congo. Recall that on December 20 last year, we saw the DR Congolese that went to the polls to cast their ballot in what was termed a very contemporary elections. Now we're looking at the context of the DRC, for instance. We know the eastern part have been ravaged by attacks from the M23 rebels. But then, how do you think, when you look at such cases or such countries with turmoils in part of the nation, do you think that this aspect, or is this a limitation of the electoral bodies, are these remote areas actually being accessed to get the overall percentage of the election results?
Or in the case of DRC, it's not possible. And the reason why I say it's not possible for us talking about free and fair elections, irrespective of the fact whether we are using technology or we are not using technology, it's because you cannot have a country with 127 different militia groups, and these militia groups are always surrounding mines, because the only reason why they are in existence is to be able, to help foreign corporations loot as much as they can, and then take them out of the continent, out of the continent. Now, if you were going to ask anyone within that particular environment, to vote even remotely, how sure are you that it's not just the rebel group that is basically surrounded everybody who is working in the mine and tells them, this is exactly what you must do by the barrel of a gun. So the notion about us having free and fair elections in the country as a DRC is going to be a farce. It's not possible. I don't think it's even something that we should even be talking about without talking about a complete liberation of that particular nation. And I think that the DRC is Africa's problem. It's no longer the DRC's or the Congolese issue. No, this is Africa's problem. We need to be able to come as Africans and liberate the DRC from corrupt foreign corporations and countries that have decided to put that place in absolute poverty chaos, where people are dying daily just so that we can have our iPhones and we can have our Samsung phones and we can run our our EVs, automobiles. It's crazy. We have to be able to make sure that Africa is responsible for helping the DRC out. In relationship to your question, would there be free and fair elections in the DRC? I'm not sure how you do that, where everyone has a gun and where all of those other territories, basically decides who they want to see in power based upon whom is it that will allow them to continue the status quo, doing what they've always done.
So how, relating that to the rest of the African continent, how true would that be, or how true would the outcome of electoral processes across the African continent be when nations are still undergoing turmoil? We're looking at Libya, for instance. Libya at the moment is under two different governments. But then if the nation one day have to hold elections, how feasible would that be for the credibility, or what does that say of the credibility of the outcome of the elections, just to globalize it with the rest of the African continent?
I think that this is where we need to now start talking about having Africans court of justice, because in a country like Libya and the DRC, we need to be in the international court. Period. Libya is it's America's problem. Libya, it's British problem. Libya, it's actually Barack Hussein's Obama's problem. Barack Hussein Obama, Hillary Clinton, these are the architects, and Tony Blair, these are the architects that literally brought Libya to her knees. These are the people who destabilized Libya in their quest for, an expansion, an extension of the Arab Spring. We have to be able to make sure that these people are brought to justice and get these countries, to build and restore order back into Libya. This has to be done. We need to be able to hold corporations responsible for the pain and the chaos that is taking place in the DRC. Unfortunately, since we are not even united on the continent, it's very difficult for us to do that. Getting to your question, can we be able to have a solution in places like Libya? Can we be able to have a situation where Libya basically becomes one, where we now have free and fair elections in Libya? Yes, we can do so. It will basically requires that the United States basically comes back and return the nation to what it was. That is no longer going to be our problem on the African continent. That won't be our problem in sub-Saharan Africa. We have suffered enough because of the issues in Libya. If we look in all of the northern Sahel, what has been happening in places like Mali, what has happened in northern part of Niger, all of these has been as a result of rebel groups running with AK-47s, traveling south through the Sahara and creating havoc in the name of military, in the level of jihad, military Islamic wings that runs into sub-Saharan Africa, creating havoc, in the northern part of the Sahel. We have to do whatever it takes to be able to make sure that the countries that have been responsible for destabilizing our individual nations on the African continent, basically begin to pay the price. And the other northern Arab nations that are on the continent of Africa needs to learn how to take care of their neighbors. I say this because we Black Africans in sub-Saharan Africa, I cannot keep quiet and close my eyes when Black Africans from sub-Saharan Africa are being sold as slaves to date in places like Libya. They are treated like garbage in places like Qatar. They are treated like garbage in Saudi Arabia. In most Arab nations, Black Africans are treated as animals. This is not me talking. Just look at the records out there and the videos. The CNN actually did a report not long, about maybe 8 years ago, tailoring exactly what was going on in places like Libya, when I'm sure Barack Hussein Obama was still in power. What a shame, that is, that we are still experiencing this on the African continent, a tradition that dates back, to the 6th and 7th century, with Muhammad himself. We have to be able to fight this. We have to be able to make sure that this level of madness does not ensue on the continent of Africa. What happens in Libya, let those boys in the north, who most often at times do not even consider themselves to be Africans, let them handle it by themselves.
Let's now move to talk about something else in the course of today's edition of the program. Now, we've seen the rise in coalition amongst opposition parties in recent times across the African continent. We saw a recent case just recently in South Africa. And of course, there has been this call by political experts across Africa for the opposition to come out united as one, or bring about one candidate for them to be able to have a free election, because it's been said that a country cannot have multiple parties and then all those parties, say 100 parties for instance, are all running for elections. Now, with this in mind, what is the power of coalition in determining the outcome of elections on the African continent?
I think that we need to be able, we can actually destroy that. We can destroy exactly this huge volume of people who are always trying to be able to create political parties just by the time a country will be having their elections. First of all, there are two tiers of people who are involved in this. The political establishment, or the folks who are in power, are always very instrumental in paying smaller, people who has any kind of influence, a couple of millions, and then for them to go out and set up this phantom political process and political parties. Because obviously speaking, if you have a country and that has like 27 different political parties, what makes you think that the person who is in power will not win the election every year? And the reason is because there is actually no unity, among, the opposition party. There has to be always one opposition party, at best two. okay, that is going against the establishment. Now, this should not be the rule of thumb, because obviously then we are also thrown into a quagmire where we don't allow folks who have, the political will to be able to exercise their political freedom and allow them to be able to participate in the electoral process. We then need to be able to say, okay, if you're going to basically create a political party, we need to see how serious you are. How many people do you have in your political party? How many registered voters do you have in your political party? If you have a certain number of people who have registered in your political party, then we can now bring you and say, okay, you're now qualified to be able, to go out and start talking about your vision for the nation and your vision for the continent. Apart from that, you are nothing else but just a stooges. You are a ploy of the political establishment. That should be what we do, rather than having 20-something different people, so incoherently shouting and talking about what they can do for the country. Meanwhile, all they're trying to do is for themselves and whoever is in power. That's not what we should do on the continent.
Now, when we talk of multiple political parties, we allude to multi-partyism on the African continent. Given back in the days where we had just one government in power, and nowadays where we already have multiple political parties existing in different countries across the continent, would you advocate for one political party in government versus a strong opposition, or better still, one party in government and multi-parties across the African continent?
I'm thinking that question is quite multifaceted, but for me, I'm thinking that we should find ways in which we have multi-parties, but with the ideas of a single party. The reason why I say so is because there has to be some kind of a hybrid solution that we bring to the table. If you look at a country like Nigeria, if you see the gains Nigeria had before she actually emerged herself into this whole entire multi-party arenas, there was a lot of gains, okay? A lot of developments and achievements were done when it was not more of a multi-party system. If you look in the case of Cameroon as a whole, you see that most of the buildings, most of the constructions we had that are still standing today was done, in the period where we didn't have any kind of a multi-party system. Just go across the board, you will see a lot of that happening. In countries where we have actually had changes in the political structure, in the political leadership rather, we have also experienced in a country like Nigeria, where one political party comes into power, and what the political party who is in power is doing is try to undermine everything that the previous political party did, so that they can look good and then sabotage everything that their predecessor did, which is absolutely wrong. We must come to a place where we understand that no political party is bigger than the country. No political party is bigger than the nation. If you are a political party, you're nothing else but just a T-shirt. You're a T-shirt to say, okay, this is my team. We are trying to play for the nation. This is my team. We're trying to play best game for the nation with the nation's interests at heart. Why should you come into come into power and then try to undo all the good things, all the gains that your predecessor, worked for? That is not good. So we have to be able to find ways in which, if any political party comes into power, we have to respect contracts. We have to respect the gains. We have to be able to respect what is it that the previous administration was doing and learn how to build on the previous administration. So there has to be a structure, more of an arbiter who is in the middle, who will be able to look at whatever are the things that the previous administration did and whatever this other administration is trying to do, to make sure that it is in the best interest of the nation, not just because some political party came into power and you're trying to undermine everything else that the other political party did. If somebody constructed a road and it was good, why don't we maintain the same contractor? If somebody came in and the person was able to build something that was absolutely wonderful, why don't we basically use that same idea into other regions of the country? The issues of us having multiple political parties without, understanding the gains that we need so far as the nation is concerned is absolutely not fruitful to the citizens of our nations. We need to make sure that if there's a political party that comes into power, let that political party's allegiance be to her citizens first. And that means maintaining what works in the previous administration, not just undermining them and then try to do your own thing because you are now in charge. That's useless. That's quite barbaric in nature.
It's all about having a transitional continuation from one government or one administration to the next. It shouldn't be felt on the African continent. Now, moving forward, you earlier on mentioned the case of the DRC, that the presence of several militant groups in that part of the country could be hampering the outcome of credible elections in that part of Africa. Now, you saw a few days ago when DRC presidents launched the construction of a resource for road project in the country. Now, could elections, in a bid to link, you know, the DRC has a lot of mines, which you stated earlier on. Could elections be at the forefront or be a channel for looting of Africa's resources? This is a general question.
Yes, of course. I think that the only reason why we have part of the problems we have on the continent of Africa when it comes to free and fair elections is actually external interference. And the reasons for external interference is because those who are interested in looting the continent will do whatever it takes to make sure that the people that are elected to power are those they can control. So they will fund, they will bring money for them to be able to run these elections. They'll give the money, you know, to pay folks who will go out and basically do whatever they need to do to destroy ballot boxes, you know, and create chaos in certain polling stations just so that, you know, certain parties can be able to win. For example, in Nigeria, I came to understand something on the eastern part of that country where if they, during the elections, there's something they have, you know, in their laws. If a particular polling station is destabilized for whatever reason, let's say, you know, some boys came in and then they started beating people up, what happens eventually is that that particular polling station will no longer be counted as part of the election. So what this means is, if I was running an election and I discovered that those in one particular area of the town do not like me, all right, that means that's my opponent's popular place. All I need to do is just get a couple of boys, mark them up, show up over there, beat people up, throw things around, and then that election in that particular place is totally cancelled. I don't understand who came up with this brilliant idea, but this is crazy. So the issue is, it is extremely quite difficult for us to talk about free and fair elections when we, even at the local level, we have stuff like that going on. So imagine a country that is really interested, like France, that is really interested in looting the continent because our whole entire economy is dependent on what Africa produces and all the other things they do on the continent. They will do whatever it takes to make sure that whoever is in power is someone they can control. And that means they will come into the electoral process and pay people, do whatever it takes to make sure that their man, the person that they want in power, stays in power. And if that was not going to be the case, whoever shows up in power, if that person also will not play game, sooner or later, that person is either kicked out or the person gets assassinated. You know, some strange accident happened to someone, which has been the pattern on the African continent. We have to come up, you know, with the long-term strategy on the continent that basically states that, and this is the reason why we cannot afford to have somebody stays in power for more than 2 terms. I don't care exactly whatever the constitution of that particular country states. You cannot allow somebody to stay in power for more than 2 terms because that's just the basis, you know, for political fraud. That's the basis, you know, for foreign interference, for foreign companies to be able to sign up some very useless deals, you know, with this particular individual and allow them to stay on their seat. And instead of them running and leading Africans, they will be running the continent, you know, as a plantation for the Western political structures, which is absolutely wrong.
Dr. Stanley, yeah, you mentioned that. Before we come back to the politics surrounding a presidential term limit, which is something I'd like us to evoke in the course of this conversation, we are seeing the African continent at a point where I could term it a neo-colonialist period at the moment. When you look at Africa, we know elections before, back in the days, they were not this type of elections that do exist on the African continent at the moment. Though democracy is good, When you look at the kind of relations that Africa do have with its past colonizers, when you look at that in a bit to create a link on the African continent, school elections or these present-day elections which we're seeing, could these have a link with the neo-colonialist tendencies which we're seeing on Africa?
Obviously, when you have the tentacles, of Europe still on the continent of Africa, running and ruling every single thing else, obviously they are meddling, and or whatever stuff we are experiencing today on the African continent is still the neo-colonial era. We are still back then. There's nothing else that has really changed. We're just experiencing it in another form. By the way, we keep talking about democracy. What does it even mean, democracy? Democracy, everybody, or democratic process, democracy. It's the people. It's the people. It's the people. Democracy basically is the people. It's the common man. It's the citizens of the nations. That's what democracy is all about. All right, democratic process is the voice of the people. Now, if you stifle the voice of the people, then there is no democracy. If you restrict people from voting, then there's no democracy. If there is fear and intimidation, okay, and or reprisal for those who basically decide to exercise their political will, then there is no democracy. You cannot be talking about democracy when people are culturally and psychologically, impeded from basically participating in the electoral process. That's not democracy. So each time we talk about democracy, it is actually laughable, because you cannot be you cannot be talking about democracy at the same time you're doing everything else that is undemocratic. You're doing every single thing else that basically causes the same thing that you're trying to celebrate, becomes laughable. All right. So we might have some second outliers, some strange things like, on the continent of Africa that has literally worked. But the truth of the matter is that the rule of thumb on the continent does not allow us to go through this.
Exactly. All it boils down to a political will across the African continent. Now, earlier on you mentioned the politics of presidential term limits, which I'd like to focus on now. And could this politics that do exist around term limits, which is suggested that every leader should be given, say, a two-term limit in power for him to be able to, say, exercise whatever vision he has for the country. In a bit not to narrow it down to Rwanda, but then could this presidential term limits cut short a leader's vision for the country, or it is going to have an impact on the political trajectory of the African continent?
Well, on the African continent, the question will be yes, it will be able to cut short the visions that we have. And the reason is because most of our economies are extremely young. Most of our countries are at their infancy in terms of our development in the 21st century. So we need to be able to have somebody who has a vision, to basically transform the nation and bring the nation to where the nation really has to be. And not people who will be controlled and manipulated, like most of our own past presidents on the African continents are. In the case of the DRC, it's quite unique. As a matter of fact, you're going to ask my opinion. I would think that Paul Kagame has the capacity to be our first African president, to basically have, I think that what he has done in Rwanda is remarkable, to have transformed that nation to what it is and continue to innovate and allow young people in the country to be able to be involved, in technology and different, spaces that will allow the nation to basically compete in the 21st century. That is remarkable. Now, on the other hand, you're looking at other nations where you have people who has been in power that has absolutely not done anything. As first of all, long before the notion of democracy actually emerged on the African continent, we were ruled by kings and queens. We were ruled by men, that was basically an autocracy. All right, there was a kingdom, there was a bunch of elders, and this bunch of elders listened to whatever was the issue. They sat down in the council with the king or with the queen, and they discussed on the best strategy to be able to help their communities and their people. And that how Africans, our kingdoms basically run. Then we had no issues with that structure, and so the notion that there is somebody, on the top who basically has the capacity to be able to lead us is that's not the problem. The problem what we have is that in most of our countries, you have people who have zero interest in building up their nations, and the only interest they have is building up themselves. And the people that surround around themselves will basically do whatever it takes to loot as much as they can, because if the person at the top is looting, what makes you think that those who surrounds him will also not loot? That is the problem that we have so far as that structure is concerned. But if you're going to ask me, I think that, us having free and fair elections is good. I think that most developed societies have basically come as a result of that. But on the continent of Africa, because of the structures we have based upon our cultures, our values, and our traditions, we have to be able to come up with a certain system that works for us as Africans, not something we import from Europe.
Exactly. And now, let's focus on the economic part. Just to reiterate that you are equally an economist. Ladies and gentlemen, if you're just joining us today, we're focusing on what are the stakes for the African continent's first elections in Africa is concerned, and we are evoking this with Dr. Stanley FONGOD, who is our expert for today. And now, economies across the African continent have been experiencing a positive trend. We've seen this in the eastern part of the African continent, where Rwanda was put at the forefront, followed by Uganda in the latest report. And according to the Economist Intelligence Unit, the continent could be the second fastest growing major region in 2024 after Asia. Now, looking at Africa's growth, it's been fueled by a small measure by a service sector that is mostly in the eastern part of the African continent. Now, Dr. FONGOD, when you look at the African continent, what are the stakes for Africa's economy as far as elections in Africa is concerned?
I'm thinking that if you look at the economic landscape on the continent of Africa, the difficulties that we face, especially when it comes in terms of funding, because the biggest problem we have on the continent of Africa is funding. Funding will take care of a lot of issues. First of all, we need to be able to have some kind of an infrastructural development that links different parts of the continent with one and another, so that we can be able to talk about the movements of goods and services. There is a geographical barrier on the continent of Africa that has limited Africa's growth and development, which most Pan-Africans do not talk about, and especially even those in the economic field do not fully understand. You have to look at the continent, and you will discover that the continent is not like any other continent on planet Earth. For example, if you look at the United States of America, if you look at the river like the Mississippi, bigger vessels, larger vessels, ships can be able to move from the Gulf of Mexico and go inland. What that means is they're carrying goods and services, they're carrying goods inland, and also carrying other goods, finished goods, out into the open sea, and then they can ship to wherever the goods need to go. That's the case in Europe. That's the case in Asia with the Rhine. But when you look at Africa, that's not the case. One of our largest rivers we have on the continent of Africa is the River Congo. The Congo River in itself has a series of waterfalls along its waterway, which means that you can absolutely not carry any vessel upstream. It's just not possible. There's nothing you can do. The Niger, which is supposed to be, one of the longest we have in West Africa, that begins somewhere in the northern part of Sierra Leone and then move inland northwards towards in the desert towards Timbuktu, and then curve around Timbuktu and exit, come down towards Nigeria and exit out in the delta. If you look at that river, no big vessels, only smaller boats can actually navigate that river. And the reason is because the way the land is structured does not allow, for navigation in terms of our waterways to be used for carrying of goods and services. We have to build, all right, railways. We have to be a railway system that is quite robust, that will allow us to be able to transport goods and services, across the continent. We have to have highways that will allow us to be able to transport goods and services, across the continent. Infrastructural development is at the key of Africa's basically emerging and becoming competitive in the 21st century. Without that, it will be extremely quite difficult. And infrastructural development will only come when somebody brings the money. Someone has to show up. Somebody must be able to fund this project. And that's why capital funding and a bond market on the continent of Africa is extremely important. There are young African entrepreneurs that needs to participate, in the economic process, but they are not. They want to be able to bring their goods and services to the marketplace, but they do not have the capacity to do so because funding is missing. So there have to be a mechanism in which we basically make sure that capital is available for young entrepreneurs, small to medium-sized enterprises on the continent of Africa to expand and then break out these sort of barriers we have, and I'm sure that if we elect the right people to power, and they will break down these border barriers that we have, and then especially in terms of economic terms, and allow goods and services to flow freely on the continent of Africa. And what will happen is prosperity will spread across the continent, because once goods and services begin to spread, it will spread both ways. Whatever is being produced in Kenya will be able to be sold in Tanzania. Whatever is produced in South Africa will be sold in Mali, and whatever is produced in Mali will be sold in Cameroon, and all of that. So goods and services will move across the continent freely, and what that will do is allow the nation to move and become more competitive in the 21st century. But as long as we keep electing bad leaders, we basically will also stop foreign investors from coming in, because when the political arena is not that stable, most investors do not want to mess with it. But when the country is good, then foreign investors, VCs, companies will be able to come in and bring the capital that we need, and most of our projects will be funded. That's how we basically use our elections to help, help our own economies.
Exactly. And that makes me recall recently we saw Egypt from a report that its foreign direct investment stood at about $40 billion for the year 2024. That is a great move for the Northeast African country. Now, looking at this aspect of attracting funding to the African continent, and looking at the impact elections do have on every nation across Africa and the world at large, what do you think that will be the impact of elections on a country's ability to attract investments into the country?
Once you have free and fair elections, and once a country has literally proven that elections are free and that there is a rule of law, what would happen is that foreign direct investments, FDI, companies that wants to be able to come in, individuals who are maybe in the VC sector that wants to be able to come into a particular country will not be thinking about what the political implications will be, because they fully understand that once they come in, there will be continuity, and there will not be an issue where the country will be thrown into chaos and they will not be able to collect their money or make their money back. So once any investors discover that there's a nation that is quite stable, that everything is doing, there's a rule of law, and all that is involved is for them to be able to take their product into the marketplace and let the market decide whether their product is good or not the government, then, foreign direct investors will come in, and the investments, will absolutely, the pocket will actually grow. And you will also discover that in countries where, except for the DRC, in countries where you really have things, lack of any political will, where there is fraud, there's election interference here and there, civil wars every day, no one is coming to invest anything in that particular nation. If you go to a place like Libya, nobody is investing anything because nobody knows exactly what will happen next. But if you go to countries that have shown some kind of stability, then you actually have even foreign chains, that are coming into that particular country to set up their own businesses, which is the testament to the fact that they trust the political process and they trust, the stability of those particular nations. But once you have a country where you have very limited, foreign entities coming in to set up anything in those countries, that simply means that they don't trust those countries, and likely the regulatory process in those particular countries for them to be able to come in is so bad that they are not even willing to try. So those are some of the issues we have to deal with.
And that would definitely impact the economic and development trajectory of the country and consequently the African continent. Now, in a bit, you earlier on mentioned that the electoral process, or better still, informing the African continent is a collective job, it's a collective one that needs the participation of every stakeholder. Now, looking at the role of the media, how does the media fit into this when it comes to informing the audience, informing the African populace as far as elections is concerned?
I think that the media is extremely very important. Most often at times, we have basically segmented our news media into either being, affiliated with different political structures, especially I've seen out in the West, and ideologies. For example, the BBC is quite liberal in terms of her own outlook. All right, they're extremely quite liberal. And what that means is anything that is liberal, that's good for them. CNN is the same thing. If you look at channels like Fox News, that's quite conservative. So, if you look at the landscape in terms of media, everybody has their own affinity. They are affiliated to some political system, structure. They will go in and basically do whatever it takes to push and promote one agenda or another. The reality is that that is not what the media is supposed to do. The media is supposed to present to the people the truth. Absolutely. The truth is what the media is supposed to present to the people, not some political ideology or persuasion. They are not supposed to be brokers in relationship to any political system or ideology. All they need to do is to basically report as they see it. Okay, not as they see it through the lens of whatever their own individual ideas and ideations, which is obviously quite difficult to do, but they report it as they see it. That simply means if you see something, report it the way you saw it, and not because of your own political persuasion. And unfortunately, we really do not have this, all right, around the world, and certainly not even on the African continent. And now, the media also on the African continent is in the situation where it's quite difficult for them to say anything, because if you do, you might end up in jail. If you do, you might be locked up. If you do, a lot of bad things can happen to you. On the continent of Africa, we have seen journalists that have been murdered by political establishment. We have seen journalists that have suddenly died from some strange accident. Strange things have happened to a lot of people, especially if that journalist is very critical of whatever establishment in any of the countries in which they are in. So, or some of them might be locked up for some trump of charges that has nothing to do with anything. So we have to be able to make sure that if you are going to be a journalist, you must do so knowing mindfully well that all you are called to do is to report the truth. And if the media, was reporting the truth the way it is, the reality is most of these political structures that we have created in our countries that is there to loot the people, and deceive the people in relationship to elections and the electoral process, most of those systems will be broken just because somebody is willing to speak the truth. And one thing that the media needs to understand is the average person, the common man, the person living in the rural area with their little tiny radio, in your ear, or somebody somewhere with a cell phone trying to be able to weave through and pick up something that is being said on YouTube, or something that some news organization in Cameroon is saying, on their Facebook page. That person is believing because the person's in the mind of that individual, he knows that whatever comes out of the mouth of the media is supposed to be true. Unfortunately, we have just learned in recent times that that has been nothing else but pure manipulation. So there's a lot of responsibility in the hands of those who are in the media to be able to speak the truth, nothing else but the truth, not your ideas, not your beliefs. I don't care what your belief is. It's not important. What I care about is for you to tell me what is true. What is the government doing? How are they doing it? Who is visiting? Who is not visiting? What is it that is what is the statistics that you're reporting on? Cite your sources. Tell me where you got that stuff from. Don't just cook up things and trump up things and tell me. I need to know whether it's viable, whether it's true or not true. Tell me the truth. Tell me as you see it, and I will make the decision as to where I belong based upon the things you say, because I know what you're saying is true. But the moment you twist it, the moment you basically begin to lie because you are paid to or because you are afraid of reporting the truth, then the local person has no choice but to basically believe whatever garbage that that the media is promoting.
Exactly, like they say, as facts are sacred. Now, to wrap up, while we continue asking ourselves the question, what is at stake as far as elections on the African continent is a concern, when we look at the current political landscape across Africa, as a political analyst, or better still as a Pan-Africanist, how would you advise Africans to approach, say, the concept of elections on the African continent so it can lead to the prosperity of the African people and, of course, the African continent?
We have to make sure that there's political stability, and the only way we achieve that is to be able to elect people into power that respects what is it that we are sending them there to do. So if there's no political stability, then it will be extremely quite difficult for us to basically start talking about any kind of continuity in the political process. And it's not just in the political process. This also translates to whatever happens in relationship to the economy. In any country, the economy will suffer once these political structures are not stable, once there's instability in the political process. But political stability is extremely very good, for the economy. What that means is that there's one thing that most economists will worry about is to how stable a particular country will be. If I'm doing projections in relationship to my business, I need to be able to know that whatever stuff I'm trying to do, the only parameters or the only things I worry about will be, price fluctuation. I have to worry about, in the case of me hiring people, if I'm going to have a good pool, if I'm going to hire the right people. In the case of me bringing in foreign investors, if the investors will be coming, and not something like political instability. Because once there's political instability, everything falls to the floor. It will be extremely quite difficult for me as a business owner, as an entrepreneur, to be able to flourish in the country that is politically not stable. Those we elect into power, we must make sure that there are people who will respect the tenets of what is it that the Constitution states. And number one, I also think that we really need on the African continent to send a referendum across the continent, and that all those who basically, altered the Constitution just so that they can stay longer in power. We have to go back to whatever it was when, when these things were written. It is sacred that we absolutely need to do that. Those documents are quite sacred. In any nation, the most sacred text in any nation is the Constitution. It is the Bible of that nation. And once we start altering things and manipulating things for our own personal gain, that is a sin to the nation. It is a sin to the fathers of the nation. It is a sin to those who basically fought and died, for the emancipation and the freedom of the nation. That is absolutely wrong. So we must be able to look into that to make sure, that we respect how sacred, our constitutions are, because that's the most sacred text any nation has.
Exactly. It's all about how African countries should be able to acknowledge how sacred our constitution is for the stability of a country. Now, in a bit to wrap up this conversation, what is the way forward for the African continent? Because we have seen the outcome of elections in recent times across Africa, both positive as well as negative. But moving forward, what is the way forward?
We have to build a society where the African fully understands that whatever they do in politics is basically public duty. It is humanitarian service that they offer. It is a civic duty. It's a civic engagement. What that means is that they are not coming into power because they're trying to make money. The worst thing to do is to elect somebody who is coming into power because they're trying to figure out how they can totally enrich themselves. You need to be able to bring people into power, men who have done things, people who have been successful, maybe, you know, in economic terms, who have built things outside of the government, who maybe might be tech engineers or, you know, somebody who has done something quite legitimate. I am not a fan of actually even having lawyers, you know, to become our politicians. So far as I'm concerned, you know, that's absolutely wrong. We need to actually start electing people who are more businessmen. I'm talking about entrepreneurs. And the reason for that is because those are the people who understand what it means to stay the course and make things work and actually make things working. Those are the people who have been involved, you know, in carrying out different trades with different nations. They have had to discuss, you know, economic issues with different parties, you know, around the world, just so that they can build up the empires they have created for themselves. I think that we need to start electing people like that, not just those who show up and give us money and then tell us that they're going to basically build us airports and give us seaports where there's no water, you know, and all of that fanciful craziness. We have to be able to do so. And if we are able to elect the right people into power, what that would do is the overall perspective or outlook of the nation and the continent will be good. We will be able to emerge out of poverty. We will now be able to compete with the rest of the world in the 21st century in technology, and we will be able to also attract a lot of foreign investors that will come into the continent because they will see a stable environment for which it is that they will invest their money, knowing very well that their returns will come. We will be able to put an end to what is happening in the DRC, and then hopefully those boys in the north will be able to take care of themselves in relationship to Libya, and the continent will be good. We can sing our kumbaya again, but it begins with the person we put in power. We have to elect the right people into power, not the person who has the biggest amount of money, but the person with the brightest vision.
True. Exactly. It's about electing the right leaders to power to lead Africa to where it wants to be. Thank you so much, Dr. Stanley FONGOD, for your insightful contribution on today's edition of Talking Point.
Thank you so much, Sharon, for having me. I hope you have a beautiful day further.
We wish you a beautiful day as well. Ladies and gentlemen, it's on that note that we shall be drawing down the curtains of today's edition of Talking Point over your #1 Pan-African channel for you Media Africa. I've been your host, NJIX. Meanwhile, programs continue over for you Media Africa.
Recording stopped.